My name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, Christmas was the one tradition that kept my family stitched together. Every December, the same messages would flood my inbox: cousins arguing over pies, my sister cracking sarcastic jokes, my mother organizing every last detail. It wasn't always warm, but at least I knew I had a place at the table. This year, the silence came first. No emails, no group chat, no welcome. Then a message from my mother, short and sharp, telling me not to worry about Christmas. Hours later, her voice on voicemail made it undeniable. We all agreed. You are not welcome. It felt less like a holiday decision and more like a verdict. I thought the coldest part was being erased until I opened the folder my grandmother had left in my name and remembered the warning she whispered before she passed. What I discovered that night set in motion a chain of events my family never saw coming. And I promise by the end, you'll see why silence became my strongest answer. Let me take you back to where it began. The first week of December in Raleigh always carried a certain chill that seeped into my apartment, leaving a thin blur of frost on the windows. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a half-empty mug of coffee beside me, the steam already fading into the air. My laptop glowed with the familiar inbox I had checked 100 times before. Every December, without fail, there would be a thread of emails about Christmas at my parents' house in Asheville. Someone would start with a cheerful subject line, my cousin Kayla usually, and then everyone else would pile in. Who was making ham, who would bake pies, what time dinner would start, who was in charge of labeling the serving spoons. Some messages had an edge of sarcasm, some made me laugh, but they were always there. This year my inbox stayed empty. I refreshed once, then again, my finger tapping the touchpad harder than necessary. Still nothing. No subject lines in all caps, no jokes about who would forget napkins this year. The screen stared back blank. My stomach sank with a weight that felt too familiar. Silence that clean never happened by accident. I opened the shared drive we had used for years. Every holiday there would be a folder labeled Christmas filled with spreadsheets and playlists. When I clicked, a red message stretched across the screen. Access denied. I tried again, clicking on an older bookmark I had saved. The same message appeared. My pulse picked up, my chest tightening. It was like walking up to a door you had opened 1,000 times before, only to find it locked from the inside. My phone buzzed against the table. The name Mom lit up with a text. The words were short. Don't worry. I figured you'd be busy this year. No need to stress about Christmas. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. There was no "we miss you," no hope you can make it, just a flat dismissal disguised as kindness. The kind of message that didn't need a reply. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet of the apartment pressing against me. I wasn't crying. I had stopped wasting tears on predictable disappointments years ago, but the heaviness in my chest pressed hard. I thought back to last Christmas when I had arrived late after a client meeting, arms full of wrapped gifts and a tray of cookies I had baked at 2 a.m. I stepped into the kitchen, the table already full, every chair taken. Caroline, my older sister, glanced up and smirked, look who finally decided to show. Laughter followed, sharp and careless. No one moved a chair, no one made space. I balanced a paper plate at the counter, eating, standing up while my family toasted each other in the dining room. I told myself it was chaos, stress, nothing personal, but deep down I knew better. Now, sitting alone with the cold coffee, the memory felt sharper. This time was different. This time they weren't forgetting. They were erasing. I poured the coffee down the sink, the swirl of brown vanishing into the drain. Outside, neighbors were stringing lights along their porches, children's laughter bouncing between yards. Inside, the air was heavy, as if the silence itself was pressing on me. I closed the laptop, not because there was nothing to see, but because I already knew what I would not find. The hours dragged, the only sound the steady tick of the kitchen clock. My phone lay face down, the words from my mother replaying in my mind. Don't worry, as if the absence of a seat at the table could be wrapped like a gift. I stood and walked to the window. Across the street, a family pulled a tree out of a box, the father adjusting the base, while the mother untangled cords of colored lights. Their daughter clapped when the top clicked into place, laughter spilling into the cold air. I pressed my palm against the glass, the chills seeping into my skin, and watched until my breath fogged the view. When I stepped back, the room felt emptier than before. Night settled. I brushed my teeth, trying to push the weight of the day aside when my phone rattled on the nightstand. Mom again. I let it ring, my toothbrush still in my mouth. After the chime, a voicemail icon appeared. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed play. Her voice filled the room flat and practiced. We all agreed. You are not welcome at Christmas. No hesitation, no sadness. It sounded like a boardroom decision, not a mother speaking to her daughter. I listened again, then again, thumb steady on the screen. By the second replay, I saved it knowing I would want proof. The words echoed in my chest, heavier each time. Not I think it would be easier. Not it hurts to say this. Just we all agreed, the collective verdict of a family I no longer recognized. I lay back staring at the ceiling. It felt like being voted out of my own bloodline. When morning came, I reached for my phone, scrolling through messages. The group chat labeled Holiday Hysteria, always buzzing this time of year, was gone. Not muted, not archived, gone. As if I had been lifted out clean. Out of habit, I tapped on Facebook. The first post was Kayla holding a glass of wine in my mother's dining room. Around her were 12 familiar faces, my mother's hand on her shoulder. The caption read, "Doing what's best for the whole family isn't always easy, but it's worth it." I zoomed until the photo blurred the chandelier I had once helped my mother pick out glinting above their heads. The dining chairs I had driven down from Raleigh to deliver, now filled with bodies who had voted me out. Comments stacked beneath. Nathan wrote, "Hard vote but necessary." Caroline added, clapping hands. I closed the app, but the words stuck like stones in my chest. I stood at the counter and poured a glass of water I never finished. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. My shoulders tense, my eyes darker. I whispered the words aloud, testing how they sounded outside my head. We all agreed. Hearing it in my own voice made it real in a way even the voicemail hadn't. By noon, I tried to bury myself in work emails, typing responses with mechanical precision. Then, a notification lit my screen. The Holiday Hysteria group had been renamed. The real ones. My access denied. The words flashed like a taunt. I set the phone down and stared at it, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. For a moment, I thought about calling Caroline, demanding an explanation, but I already knew how she would spin it. That I was too sensitive, that I made things tense, that it was better this way. The same excuses wrapped in tones that made me feel like the problem. I picked the phone back up that night, replaying the voicemail. The flat voice, the final sentence. Families could edit people out as easily as hitting delete. Pretending silence was cleaner than confrontation. I opened my laptop, staring at the empty space where the folder of holiday photos once lived. I remembered scrolling through old messages, Caroline's all-caps reminders, her sarcastic notes tagging my name. Last year I was the punchline. This year I wasn't even in the room. I walked the apartment, the boards creaking beneath my steps, the quiet too sharp. Outside, neighbors' decorations glowed, warm, inflatable snowmen bobbing in the cold. Their laughter drifted faintly through the glass. Inside my apartment, the silence pressed harder. I reached for the phone one last time before bed, not to play the message, but to make sure it was still saved. It was. Proof that I wasn't imagining it, that the exclusion wasn't a bad dream. I set the phone on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, the kind that feels sharp at the edges. My eyes stayed open longer than I wanted, waiting for the silence to soften. It never did. Morning light slipped through the blinds, faint and pale, and I pulled myself from the couch with a heaviness that had nothing to do with sleep. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the heater kicking on, a sound that reminded me of how many times I had covered the bills in other homes that weren't mine. I carried my coffee to the kitchen table, the steam curling up, and fogging my glasses for a moment. Instead of opening my email, I reached for the folder I had buried. In the corner of my laptop, a folder I had avoided for months because I knew what it held. I clicked and watched the files expand across the screen. Statements, ledgers, notarized copies, Grandma Evelyn's trust. My name in black and white, the sole trustee of everything she had built. I scrolled through the first document, and there it was, the figure that still stunned me even after 4 years. $120 million in rental properties across North Carolina and Virginia. The monthly allowance set aside from that trust, $30,000, had been leaving my account with the precision of a clock transferred to my parents since the day the papers were signed. My fingers hovered over the trackpad as I remembered Grandma's voice, steady even when her body was failing. She had looked at me from her hospital bed, her hand gripping mine with a strength that surprised me. "Do not let them use you, Lauren. Control is yours if you need it." I had nodded, too young to understand the weight of those words, too desperate to believe that my family would never put me in that position. The next file loaded slowly, a bank statement from the first year after she passed. My signature authorizing transfers. The description of payments sent directly into my parents' joint account. Mortgage covered, utilities paid, taxes handled, all of it drawn from a trust in my name. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me, and stared at the neat columns of numbers. 4 years of my life recorded in tidy rows. Vacations I had skipped, promotions I had worked for hours. I had poured into projects, all funneled into keeping them steady. I pulled the printer tray open and began printing, the pages sliding out one by one. The sound was mechanical, steady, filling the silence. I stacked each sheet, carefully aligning the edges against the table. The paper was warm against my fingers, a contrast to the chill in my chest. By the time the last document printed, a neat pile rested in front of me. I tapped it against the table until it sat square, then pressed my palm on top of it as if I needed to feel its weight. Memories stirred as I stared down at the stack. My mother's voice years earlier asking me to sign just one more form, saying it was nothing but paperwork. Caroline laughing at dinners, thanking our parents for their generosity, never once acknowledging where the generosity had come from. My cousin Nathan boasting about how our family always kept things together while I had been the one stitching the seams behind the curtain. I pushed back from the table and began pacing the small space of the apartment. My socks slid slightly against the hardwood floor, the boards creaking under each step. I clenched and unclenched my fists as if the movement might loosen the knot tightening in my chest. I stopped at the window, looking out at the street below, at the glow of wreaths and strings of lights on porches, families moving in and out with boxes of decorations. They looked warm and whole, and for a moment I hated how easy it seemed for them. I turned back the stack of papers sitting there like a mirror. Every line of print told me the same story. I had been the quiet engine of their life. The mortgage payment of $1,420 each month, unfailing for 48 months. The electric bills that rose in the winter and dipped in the spring, paid automatically from accounts in my name. Internet, gas, insurance, all sliding out while no one asked, no one thanked, no one saw. I picked up the top page and ran my thumb over the embossed stamp, the notary mark pressed into the corner. Grandma's instructions echoed again. Do not let them use you. Control is yours. I had ignored that warning, convinced that love meant trust, that trust meant silence. I sat again and pulled a notepad from the drawer. With a pen in hand, I copied figures down one by one, writing the dates, the amounts, the accounts. Each stroke of the pen steadied me, made it more real. January 2020. Mortgage. $1,420. February 2020. Same. March 2020. Same. 4 years of identical lines. My handwriting grew firmer, the ink pressing deep into the paper. The phone buzzed on the table, a notification lighting the screen, but I ignored it. I wrote until the page filled, then turned to another, copying utilities, taxes, insurance. By the time I set the pen down, I had built my own ledger hand-drawn proof of what I had carried alone. I pressed my hands flat against the table, breathing deep. The reflection in the dark laptop screen caught my eye, my face sharper, my eyes harder. The numbers had always been clean, orderly, but now they felt like chains. Chains I had wrapped around myself while everyone else danced in the light of them. I stood and walked to the counter, pulling open the drawer that held physical copies I had never trusted to leave in the cloud. The manila folder was thick, corners worn. Inside, the same statements stamped and signed. I spread them across the counter, the paper edges curling upward slightly. I ran my hand across them, the sound of paper rasping under my palm. The anger rose sudden hot, then drained into something colder. Clarity. I wasn't looking at generosity. I was looking at a transaction, one they had disguised as family obligation. I had been footing the bill for a house I would never call mine, keeping warm the rooms where I wasn't even welcome at the table. I gathered the papers back into the folder, sliding them in neatly, closing the flap with a sharp crease. The apartment was silent again, but this silence didn't feel heavy. It felt sharpened like a blade. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, though the first still sat half full. The steam rose and blurred my vision for a moment, but I didn't blink it away. I let it settle, then set the mug down. Back at the laptop, I created a new folder on the desktop. My fingers hovered for a moment before I typed the words. Frozen accounts. The name glowed back at me, small and square on the screen. One by one, I dragged the documents inside. Mortgage statements, utilities, tax receipts, insurance records. Each file slipped into place with a quiet click, like pieces of a puzzle forming a picture I could no longer ignore. By the time I closed the laptop, the light outside had shifted. The sun was low, washing the room in a pale orange glow. I stood at the window watching a delivery truck pull into the neighbor's driveway. The driver carried boxes wrapped in festive tape, the child on the porch clapping with delight. I stayed there until the truck drove away, the porch lights flicking on their house, glowing warm against the dark. Behind me, my apartment stayed dim. The folder sat quietly on the desktop, holding years of proof. For the first time, I let the awareness settle in me fully. I had not imagined the weight. It was real. It was documented. And it was mine to control. The quiet in the room shifted, no longer empty, but filled with the outline of a decision forming slowly in the background. It waited, steady, patient, knowing its time was coming. The sound of my phone vibrating against the wooden table startled me out of my thoughts. I had been staring at the closed laptop for so long that my eyes had blurred the folder I had created, still glowing in my mind like a quiet dare. The screen lit up with Tammy's name. My cousin never called unless something was wrong. I hesitated, thumb hovering, then swiped to answer. Her voice was low, shaky. Lauren, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to say it came from me. I sat up straighter, my stomach twisting. Tammy was the quiet one in the family, the one everyone ignored or spoke over at gatherings. If she was calling me like this, it meant she was holding something heavy. I promised, though. My voice came out thin. She took a breath, the sound of it catching in her throat, then said she had recorded part of a conversation during dinner at my parents' house. She had not planned to, she explained quickly, but the phone was in her lap, the recorder accidentally on, and she had kept it once. She realized what they were saying. The line went silent as the file arrived. I tapped it with trembling fingers and pressed play. Caroline's voice filled the room, sharp and mocking. Lauren acts cold, like she wants applause for being decent. Laughter followed, familiar and cruel. My chest tightened as I heard my mother Elaine speak next. She's not really family, just convenient. The words sliced through me. Convenient. My sister's husband Brian chimed in, his tone smug. Keep her name on the trust. It's clean. No need to stir the pot. More laughter rose, overlapping clinking glasses in the background. I hit pause, my hand shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. The silence that followed was deafening. I pressed play again, listening through every word, every chuckle. By the third time, my eyes were wet, tears slipping down my face before I could stop them. I pressed the heel of my hand hard against my mouth to keep the sob from escaping, but the words echoed louder in my head. Not really family, just convenient. Tammy's whisper came through the phone. I am so sorry. They will never admit it, but I thought you should know. My throat felt raw when I tried to answer. Thank you, Tammy. My voice cracked on the second word. She promised she would not tell anyone we spoke, and then she was gone, leaving me with the recording replaying in my mind. I set the phone on the table, staring at it as if it might burn through the wood. The apartment suddenly felt too small. I stood pacing across the floorboards back and forth until my legs ached. Convenient. The word wrapped around me like a chain. Every holiday meal, every check I had signed, every sacrifice I had justified. All of it had been seen as nothing more than convenience. I walked into the kitchen, pulled the manila folder from the drawer, and spread the documents across the counter again. My hands moved quickly, snapping photos with my phone, dropping them into the folder I had named Frozen Accounts. With each click of the camera, I felt steadier, colder. This was not just betrayal. This was evidence. When I stopped, the apartment was silent again, the only sound my uneven breathing. I picked up the phone and pressed play once more, letting their voices fill the room. Caroline laughing, my mother's calm dismissal, Brian's smug assurance. I dragged the file into the evidence folder, renaming it Family Recording. My fingers did not tremble this time. I walked back to the window, the street outside lit by strings of holiday lights. Children ran between houses, their voices carrying high and joyful. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, closing my eyes. Behind my lids, I saw the dining room I had grown up in, the chandelier, glowing above their heads, their laughter echoing while they carved me out of their lives. I whispered the word aloud, tasting its bitterness. Convenient. It did not sound like family. It sounded like a transaction, like a tool picked up and discarded when no longer useful. My chest tightened again, but the tears did not come this time. Instead, something inside me shifted, slow and certain. The recording was not just proof of what I already knew. It was a turning point. I could no longer excuse their cruelty as stress or misunderstanding. They had spoken it aloud with laughter and certainty. I pulled a pen from the drawer and wrote the word across the top page of my notepad. I pressed the letters hard into the paper until the tip tore through. Convenient. I stared at it, the ink bleeding around the edges, then underlined it once, twice, 3 times. The apartment felt colder as I sat back, my arms wrapped tight around myself. I thought of Grandma Evelyn again, her words ringing louder than ever. Do not let them use you. Control is yours. I had ignored her, convinced my family would never cut me so deeply. Now her warning pulsed through me like a drumbeat. I gathered the papers again, stacking them with sharp edges, slid the pen into the crease of the notepad, and closed it with a snap. The sound echoed through the apartment, final and steady. I walked to the sink, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were red, but behind them something new had settled. Not rage, not grief, but clarity. The phone buzzed again on the table, Tammy's name lighting up once more. A single message appeared. They will never admit it, but at least now you know. I picked it up, reread the line twice, and then placed the phone gently back down. The night pressed in from the windows, the glow of the neighbors' lights sharp against the dark. My apartment remained quiet, but not the suffocating quiet of before. This silence was sharper, steadier, filled with the weight of proof and the faint outline of a choice forming in the distance. Night crept over Raleigh like a slow tide, shadows pooling in the corners of my apartment, while the glow of the laptop lit the table. I sat there with the stack of papers beside me, the word convenient still carved deep into my notepad. My stomach felt hollow, though I had not eaten since breakfast. I reached for my phone, scrolled through contacts, and hovered over the name I had not touched in years. David Lawson, the lawyer who had handled Grandma Evelyn's estate. My thumb pressed before I could second-guess myself. The line rang twice before a steady voice answered. Lauren Mitchell, it has been a while. What can I do for you? I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat before spilling out. I have something you need to hear. I put him on speaker and played the voicemail from my mother. We all agreed. You are not welcome at Christmas. His silence stretched as the recording ended. I did not speak. Then I opened the file Tammy had sent and played the recording of Caroline, my mother, Brian. Their laughter filled the apartment again, echoing into the quiet line. When it ended, David exhaled slowly. Lauren, the trust gives you full authority. You do not need their agreement to act. His words were firm, deliberate. You are the trustee. You control distribution. If you choose to suspend payments, you are within your rights. I pressed my hand against my forehead, the skin warm beneath my palm. They depended on those transfers. Without them, the mortgage, the credit cards, the taxes, all of it would collapse. David's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. I can draft letters tonight. Tomorrow morning, they can go out to the banks and property managers. You will have immediate control over revenues. No further consent is needed. I hesitated, fingers curling around the edge of the table. My voice came out softer than I wanted. If I do this, there is no going back. That is correct, he replied. But remember, your grandmother set it up this way for a reason. She gave you power for moments when their behavior left you no choice. Use it. I closed my eyes, Grandma's face flashing in my memory. Her grip on my hand, her voice warning me not to let them use me. I opened my eyes and saw the evidence piled around me, the numbers, the recording, the voicemail. The pieces all pointed in the same direction. All right, I whispered. Do it. David's tone sharpened with efficiency. I will prepare the enforcement letters tonight. A courier will deliver them to you in the morning for signature. From there, everything moves quickly. After the call ended, I sat in the silence, the apartment heavier now but steadier too. I pushed the chair back, the scrape loud against the wood floor, and stood at the counter. I filled a glass with water, drank half in one swallow, then set it down with a soft thud. My reflection in the dark window looked different, the hesitation I had carried replaced by something harder. I walked back to the table, opened a new document, and began typing. The words came simple, clean. Cease allowance effective December 20th. I stared at the line, the cursor blinking at the end like a metronome. My chest rose and fell slowly, the decision written in black and white. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and leaned back. The hum of the heater filled the room, but it did not drown the racing of my thoughts. I let my eyes drift shut, exhaustion pulling at me. When I opened them again, the room was dark, except for the faint glow of the clock. I stood, pulled the blind shut, and switched off the lamp. The apartment sank into darkness, the decision still pulsing in my mind. My phone lay on the nightstand, face down, silent. I crawled under the blanket, eyes open to the shadows above me. The words of my grandmother and the sound of my mother's voice overlapped in my mind, colliding and splitting apart until sleep finally dragged me under. The knock at my door came earlier than I expected, sharp and steady against the quiet morning. I pulled on a sweater and opened it to find a courier standing there, his gloved hands clutching a thick envelope. He asked for my signature, his pen scratching across the clipboard as I scrawled my name. When the door clicked shut behind me, I held the envelope against my chest for a moment before tearing it open at the kitchen table. Inside were neatly bound packets from David's office, the language formal and unyielding. Notices of suspension of the monthly allowance. Orders transferring all rental income streams solely to my signature. Directives to banks and credit card issuers halting access tied to my authorization. Each page carried the authority of law, each seal heavy with finality. I spread the documents across the table, lining them up like cards in a hand I had been waiting years to play. The black print looked almost sharp against the white paper, the edges crisp. My hands shook slightly as I flipped page after page, not from fear, but from the release of something long held back. The phone buzzed. David's voice came through, calm and precise. The letters are in motion. Copies went out by email last night. Physical delivery will hit the banks today. By the weekend, the restrictions will take effect. He paused as if weighing whether to say more, then added, You will likely hear from them soon. Stay steady. You are within every right. I thanked him, my voice firmer than it had been the night before. After we hung up, I returned to the papers, my fingertips pressing each page into place. The weight of them grounded me. I opened the drawer beside the table and pulled out the manila folder I had started filling. One by one, I slipped the documents inside, labeling each with a sticky note in bold marker. Allowance suspension, revenue control, bank directive. Evidence layered neatly until the folder was thick edges stiff with order. I stood and walked to the window, the morning light pale against the frost outside. Across the street, a neighbor carried a bag of groceries into her house, her scarf trailing behind her. I wondered if she had any idea what kind of battles were fought quietly inside other people's walls. Back at the counter, I made a pot of coffee, the scent filling the air. As it brewed, I imagined my parents at a store swiping a card that suddenly declined. The picture came sharp, not from cruelty, but from reality settling in. For years, my name had made their lives seamless. With a few signed pages, the seams were gone. I carried the mug back to the table and sat with the folder open beside me. My reflection in the dark screen of the laptop showed a face both weary and resolved. I lifted the cup to my lips and let the heat spread through me. The hours passed quietly, the documents sitting like sentinels on the table. Every so often I reached out to touch them, as if to remind myself they were real, not imagined. The sound of the refrigerator hummed steady in the background, my breath keeping time with it. By late afternoon, I placed the folder carefully in the drawer and closed it with a soft push. I wiped the table clean, the surface bare again, except for the notepad with the word convenient still pressed into its top page. I laid my hand flat on it, feeling the ridges of the ink beneath my palm. Outside, children ran past in heavy coats, their laughter trailing through the cold. Lights flickered on along porches one by one until the street glowed warm, in contrast to the dark settling in my apartment. I stood at the window until my legs ached, then pulled the blinds shut. When I finally sat back down, the folder hidden again in the drawer, I let the silence settle. It was not the silence of exclusion anymore. It was the silence of preparation, the calm before something inevitable. I pressed my hands together, leaned forward, and let the thought take full shape. By next week, everything would begin to shift. The first call came just after 9 the next morning, the phone vibrating against the kitchen counter while I buttered toast. I glanced at the screen and saw Caroline's name flashing, her persistence, familiar, her tone already playing in my mind before I even picked up. I let it ring through the sound sharp in the quiet room until it clicked to voicemail. A moment later, the message alert chimed. Her voice poured out, clipped and heated. "You are tearing this family apart, Julia. Do you even realize what you've done? Mom is beside herself. Dad hasn't slept. We can't even pay for the Christmas catering because the account declined. You need to fix this right now." I leaned against the counter, my toast forgotten, and listened to her anger fill the air. When it ended, I replayed it once more, slower this time, and then saved it directly into my folder. Caroline always thought shouting meant authority, but now her words sounded like proof. By midday, the texts started arriving, each one more frantic than the last. Nathan wrote in his short-clipped style, "Mortgage payment bounced. What did you do?" Then Kay sent a group message. "The lights went out during rehearsal dinner prep. Guests are furious. Mom says you sabotaged us." I scrolled through them, my thumb moving steady, screenshotting each one before dropping them into my evidence folder. The phone rang again, this time my mother's number. I let it vibrate on the counter, my chest tight until it stopped. The voicemail that followed was quieter than Caroline's, almost rehearsed. "Julia, I don't know why you are doing this. We are still your family. Please remember that." Her words lingered, softer but heavier. "Still your family." I pressed the phone to my ear and closed my eyes, her voice echoing in the space where trust used to live. When the message ended, I saved it too. I made another pot of coffee and carried a mug to the table. The folder sat open beside me, the files stacking higher with every hour. I traced the tabs with my fingertip, the words clear and cold. Allowance, revenue, suspension, voicemails, texts, each one building a record of what could no longer be denied. By late afternoon, a knock rattled my door. I hesitated, then opened it to find Tammy standing there, her cheeks flushed from the cold, a knit scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She slipped inside quickly, glancing down the hall before the door shut. "I can't stay long," she whispered, pulling her phone from her pocket. "But I thought you should hear this." She tapped the screen and pressed play. The recording was muffled at first, voices overlapping, then Caroline's rose clear. "We need her back. No one else can handle the bills. Mom, we are drowning." Then Brian's voice, lower and tight. "This looks terrible for me at work. People are asking questions." The file ended abruptly. Tammy's eyes met mine, uncertain. "They wanted me to convince you to come back." I let out a long breath, the weight of their panic heavy but not surprising. "Tell them to figure out how to stand without me," I said quietly. Tammy nodded, her lips pressing together in something between relief and guilt. We sat for a while at the table, mugs of tea between us, steam curling into the quiet. She told me about her classes, about her roommate, about things that felt almost normal. I listened, grateful for the softness of her presence in a week filled with sharp edges. When she left, the apartment settled into silence again. I closed the folder and set it aside, the room dim in the fading light. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, stronger, somehow, though my shoulders ached from the tension of the day. I stood for a long while, watching the snow fall slow and steady onto the street below. My phone buzzed again on the table behind me, another flood of messages lighting up the screen. I didn't move to check them. The snow was quieter, steadier, and for the first time in years it felt like enough. The email arrived early the next morning while I was sipping coffee at the kitchen table, the steam fogging my glasses. The subject line was in all caps, Caroline's usual style when she wanted to sound in control. Legal action. My stomach tightened, but my hands were steady as I clicked it open. Her words were clipped, like she had dictated them through clenched teeth. "We will be pursuing a lawsuit. You have caused financial harm. Prepare yourself." I leaned back in the chair, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. For a moment, I stared at the screen, waiting for the panic I thought would come, but it never did. Instead, I felt an odd calm settle over me. I took a screenshot, labeled it in my folder, and shut the laptop. The words carried no weight, because for the first time I knew where I stood. By mid-morning, my phone rang with a number I recognized from old contracts. David Miller, a lawyer I had worked with during nonprofit disputes, spoke briskly when I answered. "Your sister is shopping for attorneys, Julia, but I told them they are wasting their money. Everything is in your name. Mortgage, utilities, tax accounts, all tied directly to you. That means you had every legal right to freeze them." His voice was calm, unshakable. "Even if they find a lawyer willing to take their case, no judge will give it air. You protected yourself from exploitation." I closed my eyes, relief flooding through me. "Thank you, David," I whispered. He paused, his tone softening. "You have carried them long enough. They cannot twist the law the way they twisted you. You are free." When the call ended, I sat still, letting his words sink in. Free. It sounded foreign on my tongue, but the truth of it spread through me like warmth. My phone buzzed again minutes later. A text from my mother, her words oddly polite. "We spoke with a lawyer. He said you are within your rights. But Julia, we are still your family. Why are you doing this?" I read it twice, then saved it without replying. That afternoon, another headline appeared on my feed. The Charlotte Chronicle ran a story about the charity potluck, stripped of Elaine Bennett's name. The board had released a statement thanking her for past service, but announcing new leadership due to discrepancies in donor contributions. Her reputation had been cut from the community she cherished most. I pictured her sitting at her desk, the phone pressed to her ear, as neighbors whispered. She had built her life on appearances, on Sunday potlucks and polished smiles. and now it had slipped from her hands. My chest felt tight not with joy but with a strange steadiness. Justice did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came as silence, a name missing where it once stood. By evening, Tammy texted again. Mom is pacing, Caroline is furious, Nathan left the house. Everyone is blaming each other. I typed back a short thank you, nothing more. The snow outside had started again, flakes drifting against the window, the street below muffled and pale. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat by the glass watching the lights blur through falling white. The phone buzzed once more, this time with a restricted number. I answered hesitantly, and a man's voice identified himself as a compliance officer from the regional bank. We are reviewing an audio file concerning Brian Bennett's comments on loan documentation. Effective immediately, he has been placed on administrative leave. The words rang sharp in my ear. I murmured a brief acknowledgement, offering no more detail, and hung up. I imagined Brian in his office, blinds half drawn, his supervisor replaying his own voice. Keep her name on the papers. It is clean. No need to rock the boat. Words that once dismissed me now cut directly into his career. I sat back on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter, the weight of years shifting at last. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and steady, covering the street like a fresh page waiting to be written. Inside, the silence no longer pressed against me. It felt lighter, like space opening up where fear used to live. The next morning began with a steady stream of notifications flashing across my phone screen, each one sharper than the last. Caroline sent the first message before the sun had fully risen. You ruined everything. Do you even understand what you've done? Mom is humiliated. The family looks like fools. Her words filled the screen in jagged lines, and for a moment, I just stared at them, feeling nothing but the familiar echo of her blame. I scrolled to the next one, Kay this time, accusing me of destroying the family's reputation, of making Christmas into a spectacle for the neighbors. Then Nathan, quieter but still cutting. No one will forget this, Julia. You'll regret it. I sat at the kitchen table, the phone heavy in my hand, and one by one I screenshotted each message and tucked them into the evidence folder on my laptop. They thought their threats would scare me, but all they did was build my case. By mid-morning, my mother finally reached out. Her message was short, almost pleading. We are still family. That was all she wrote, as if the same woman who had voted me out could smooth it over with 5 words. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard before setting the phone down without replying. Silence was the only answer left to give. Later that afternoon, Tammy called. Her voice was hushed, careful, as though she feared someone might overhear. They are all fighting, she told me. Caroline is blaming Brian, Mom is blaming Kay, Nathan won't even speak. It's chaos. I could hear voices raised faintly in the background, muffled by walls, and I pictured the house in Charlotte unraveling room by room. When Tammy hung up, I carried my mug of coffee to the window. Snow still blanketed the sidewalks, cars inching carefully along the salted road. Across the street, a neighbor's house glowed with steady Christmas lights, warm against the gray sky. My reflection looked back at me from the glass, steady and calm, while their voices crackled in the distance like a storm I had finally stepped out of. By evening, the calls started one after another. First Caroline, her name lighting up the screen again and again. Then Brian, his number flashing like an alarm. Finally, my mother, her voice sharp in the voicemail she left. You think this makes you strong, Julia, but all you've done is tear us apart. People are asking questions. You will regret this. I saved it with the rest, labeling it carefully before closing the folder. Their words no longer pierced. They were just evidence now, pieces of a truth they had written themselves. That night, I lit a single lamp in the living room and curled up with the blanket wrapped around me. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the street below quiet and still. My phone buzzed every few minutes, their chaos spilling across the screen, but I let it rest face down on the table. For the first time, the silence in my apartment felt steady. Not empty, not punishing, but proof that I had finally stepped out of their storm. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, closed my eyes, and let the quiet carry me into the night. The following afternoon, I heard a knock at my door, soft but steady, and when I opened it, I found Norma Fisher from 2 doors down, standing there with a small plate covered in foil. She was bundled in her wool coat, her gray hair tucked neatly under a knitted hat, and when she smiled, it was the kind that made the cold air feel a little less sharp. "Oatmeal cookies," she said, gently stepping inside when I motioned her in. "Figured you might need something sweet." The warmth of cinnamon and sugar filled the apartment as she set the plate on the counter. Norma had lived in the building for years, but our conversations had never gone beyond polite greetings in the hallway. Now she sat at the edge of my couch, folding her gloves carefully in her lap, and looked at me with a steady gaze that carried more weight than words. "I saw the news," she said after a pause, "about your mother, about the accounts. People whisper, you know how it goes. But let me tell you something. You are stronger than they ever gave you credit for." I stood with a mug of tea in my hand, unsure how to respond, but her words sank deep, heavier than any headline. Norma went on, her voice calm but certain. "Elaine feared you because she could not control you. That is why she tried to cut you out." Hearing it spoken so plainly from someone outside my family stripped away the excuses I had carried for years. My chest loosened, and I found myself sinking into the chair across from her, letting out a breath I had not realized I was holding. We shared cookies in the quiet of the apartment, the sweetness simple and grounding. Norma stayed only a short while, but before she left, she slipped her gloves back on and touched my hand lightly. "You do not need them to see your worth," she said, her eyes soft but unflinching. After she was gone, the apartment felt warmer. Not because of the cookies, but because kindness had finally broken through the silence. I made myself a simple dinner that evening, pasta with garlic and olive oil, and poured a glass of wine while the water boiled. The ritual of chopping garlic and listening to it sizzle in the pan steadied me more than I expected. Later that night, I sat by the window with my plate balanced on my lap. The street below was quiet, lamplight glowing on the thin crust of snow that still covered the sidewalks. My phone rested on the table beside me, dark and silent for once. I did not reach for it. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of their chaos lift from my shoulders. The house in Charlotte could burn with shouting and blame, but here, in my small apartment in Durham, the quiet no longer hurt. It hummed with something softer, steadier, like the faint glow of a candle that would not be blown out. I took another sip of wine and let the warmth spread through me, knowing that tomorrow would bring more messages, more noise, but tonight I could allow myself this peace. The night stretched still and unbroken, and I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the steady beat of my own breath. 2 days later, Tammy showed up at my door, with her scarf half unraveled around her neck and cheeks red from the cold. She stepped inside, quickly shutting the door, as though she was afraid someone might have followed her. In her hand, she held her phone, the screen already cued to play a recording. "They asked me to talk to you," she said quietly, her eyes searching mine. Before I could answer, she pressed play. The sound was muffled at first, voices overlapping with the clatter of dishes in the background. Then Caroline's voice came through, sharp and impatient. "We need her back. No one else can handle the bills. We are drowning." Brian's voice followed, lower but tense. "This is making me look terrible at the bank. People are asking questions." Then my mother's voice broke in, shaky but firm. "Maybe if she sees we still want her, she will come back." The file ended abruptly, and the silence in my living room filled with their words. Tammy held her phone close to her chest, as if it burned to touch. "They wanted me to convince you," she whispered, "but I could not." I sank into the chair at the table, my breath coming slow. "Tell them to focus on keeping the lights on before they worry about me," I said finally. Tammy gave me a small smile, almost hidden, like she had expected that answer. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and sat down across from me. For the next hour, we spoke about her graduate program, her professors, the paper she had stayed up late to finish. I listened, grateful for the normal rhythm of her voice, the way it smoothed the sharp edges of the past weeks. When she left, she hugged me briefly, her scarf brushing my cheek. "Be well," she murmured, before stepping into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me in the quiet of my apartment. I stood at the counter for a long while afterward, sipping tea that had gone lukewarm. My laptop rested on the table, the evidence folder glowing faintly on the screen. I did not open it. Instead, I looked around the room, small but mine, the lamplight soft across the walls. For years I had mistaken their chaos as proof that I belonged, that I had to keep fixing and paying. But here in this space I realized peace was worth more than any invitation. The next morning, I pulled on my coat and drove across town to the bank. The sky was low and gray, the kind of winter morning that made the city feel still. Dirty snow edged the sidewalks, and my boots crunched as I crossed the lot. On the passenger seat beside me was a thick folder neatly organized with notarized forms and account records. Inside, the warmth of the building wrapped around me, the faint smell of coffee drifting from somewhere behind the counters. A young teller directed me down a carpeted hallway to a loan officer's office. He looked up from his desk. When I stepped in, his expression professional, his glasses catching the light. I placed the folder on his desk and slid it toward him. "I need to remove my name from the mortgage on a property in Charlotte. The loan lists me as co-borrower, but the title belongs solely to Elaine Bennett. She will assume full liability." The officer adjusted his glasses and opened the folder, scanning the documents carefully. His pen tapped once against the desk. "You have the notarization. This is complete. By signing here, you release any responsibility tied to this loan." I picked up the pen, the weight of it steady in my hand, and signed my name one final time. The stamp landed with a sharp thud, sealing the papers. It was done. When I walked back outside, the cold bit against my cheeks, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. Each breath left my mouth in white puffs. As I crossed the lot, the folder, thinner now, but my shoulders freer. Back in my car, I sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the snow begin to fall again. For so long I had been tethered to that house, its bills, its weight, its silence. Now the rope had been cut. I drove home slowly, the road slick but familiar. In my apartment, I set the thin folder on the table and opened my laptop. The evidence folder filled the screen, rows of files lined neatly like soldiers. I scrolled through them slowly, each one a reminder of what I had endured and what I had let go. For months that folder had been my shield, my record of survival. Now, as I closed the lid, it felt less like a weapon and more like a period at the end of a long sentence. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the window while the snow thickened outside. The world below was hushed, blanketed in white, and for the first time I believed the silence was mine to keep. The storm outside had calmed by the time I woke the next morning, but the storm on my phone had not. Dozens of unread messages blinked across the screen, each one more frantic than the last. Caroline had sent an email with the subject line screaming in bold, "Legal threat." She wrote that the family would sue me for damages, that I had humiliated them in front of the entire community. I opened it, read it twice, then saved it into my folder without a flicker of fear. Not long after, the phone rang with a number I had not seen in years. David Miller's voice came through, steady and sharp as a closing door. "Julia, they are shopping for lawyers again, but I told them it is pointless. Everything you froze is in your name." The judge would laugh them out of the room. His certainty washed over me like warm water after standing too long in the cold. I whispered, "Thank you," barely trusting my voice, and he paused. "You don't owe them explanations anymore. You carried them long enough." When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling beside me, staring at the rising sun through the frosted glass. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. Her message was softer, almost pleading. "We spoke to an attorney. He said you are within your rights. But Julia, we are still your family. Why are you doing this?" The words pressed heavy against my chest, not because they carried power, but because I heard the fear beneath them. I saved the screenshot and filed it away with the rest. By mid-afternoon, the Charlotte Observer published another article, this one longer and sharper. Legal sources confirmed that all accounts tied to the Bennett property were held in my name, granting me full authority to suspend or cancel payments. The article noted how years of generosity had been misattributed and how the community felt shocked to learn the truth. I scrolled through the lines slowly, my hands steady. For so long, I had believed that truth would never find air outside my apartment. Now it was printed for anyone to see. Elaine Bennett's name was missing from every board page, her photo erased from the charity site. Silence had replaced her reputation. Tammy texted again later in the day. Mom is silent. Caroline is pacing holes in the carpet. Brian stormed out. Everyone is pointing fingers. Her words painted a picture I did not need to imagine, voices ricocheting off the walls of that Charlotte house, blame moving like wildfire, no one stopping to see the embers they had lit themselves. By evening, another call came. The voice on the line was clipped professional, identifying himself as a compliance officer from Brian's bank. We have reviewed the audio file regarding Mr. Bennett's remarks on loan documentation. Effective immediately, he is suspended pending investigation. I thanked him calmly, giving nothing more, and ended the call. I pictured Brian in his office, blinds half closed as his supervisor replayed his own words. Keep her name on the papers. It is clean. No need to rock the boat. The arrogance that once dismissed me had circled back and cut his career open. Snow began to fall again outside, drifting soft in the lamplight, and I stood at the window watching it collect on the bare branches. Inside, the apartment hummed with quiet. My phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting with more messages, but I did not move to check them. I wrapped my blanket tighter around me, sipping coffee gone lukewarm, and let the silence stretch. The house in Charlotte was fractured. Their reputations were cracking one by one, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to defend myself or chase their approval. The law had spoken. The truth had settled. All I had to do was breathe in the quiet and let the snow keep falling. The knock on my door came just after 3 in the afternoon, soft and almost hesitant. When I opened it, Tammy stood there with her scarf tucked tight around her neck, her eyes red as if she had been holding back tears. She stepped inside and pulled her phone from her coat pocket before saying a word. "I think you should hear this," she whispered and tapped play. The voices on the recording were sharp and frantic. Caroline's rang out first, high and strained. "She ruined us. Everything is falling apart." Brian's voice followed, lower but ragged. "My job is gone. I told you this would backfire." Then my mother's words broke through, trembling. "Maybe if we can get her to forgive us, we can fix it." The clip ended there, silence filling the room as Tammy tucked the phone back into her coat. I leaned against the counter, letting their desperation sink in. "Tell them, forgiveness does not pay mortgages," I said quietly. And Tammy gave a small nod. She stayed for tea, telling me about her coursework and her roommate's habit of leaving dishes in the sink. For an hour, it almost felt like life was simple again, without weight. That night, I pulled out the last of my paperwork, the notarized forms confirming that my name was no longer tied to their property. I spread them across the kitchen table, running my hand over the crisp stamps. The house was theirs to carry now. Their debts, their bills, their silence. I had finally stepped free. The next morning, I drove out toward Falls Lake, the roads clear of snow but edged with slush. I parked near the water and walked along the trail, the air biting cold against my face. The lake stretched wide and still ice forming thin layers near the edges. I stood there for a long time, breathing in air that felt sharp and clean. For the first time in years, I felt like I could fill my lungs without fear of suffocating. When I returned home, my phone was heavy with messages most unread. Caroline had sent another string of accusations. Nathan had written nothing but silence. My mother's words grew shorter, each time the last one a simple line: "We need you." I set the phone down and let the screen dim. Their needs were no longer mine to answer. That evening I made dinner slowly, chopping vegetables with care, simmering broth until the kitchen filled with warmth. The radio played quietly in the background, a song I half remembered from years ago, and I found myself humming along. I ate at the table with no rush, no one watching, no one judging. Just me, the meal, and the quiet. As I cleared the dishes, I glanced at the evidence folder still sitting on my laptop. It had been my shield, my proof, my weapon. Now it felt like a closed book, heavy but finished. I scrolled through the files one last time, each screenshot and receipt lined up neatly, then closed the lid. I did not need to add anything more. Outside, the snow had begun again, flakes catching the glow of the streetlights. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and sat by the window, watching the world turn pale and soft. The chaos of Charlotte was far behind me now. Their voices no longer filled my head. My life, steady and quiet, stretched in front of me like the fresh snow covering the street. If you have ever carried a family that refused to see you, if you have ever given until you were invisible, I want you to hear this. You are not weak for stepping back. You are not cruel for choosing peace. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is close the door on those who only loved your sacrifices and never your soul. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from a family or friendship that drained you dry? Share your story in the comments and let me know where you are watching from. If this story touched something in you, please like this video and subscribe, because there are more stories to tell and more truths waiting to be heard.